Welcome and thank you for joining this special event that brings together the Global FoodBanking Network and the Global Child Nutrition Foundation. We're going to talk about the necessity of ending child hunger and malnutrition because we want to help achieve prosperity and stability for all nations. I'm Catherine Bertini. I'm a distinguished fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And in this session, where I understand over 38 representatives of 38 countries are participating, we're going to discuss findings from the Global FoodBanking Network's new report, Healthy Nations Start with Healthy Children. We're going to discuss the importance of partnerships with groups like the Food Banking Network and the school feeding programs. We're going to learn about One Food Bank Network's breakfast program, and we're going to hear about private sector engagement in child feeding programs. It's really a team effort, and that's what this presentation will bring to you today. We have a fantastic panel. Lisa Moon, who's the president and CEO of the Global Food Banking Network. Arlene Mitchell, who's the executive of the Global Child Nutrition Foundation. Juan Carlos Buitrago Ortiz, who's executive director of Asociación de Bancos de Alimentos de Colombia. And Stephanie Slingerland, senior director of Philanthropy and Social Impact at the Kellogg Company. So just before our speakers, I have a couple of housekeeping announcements to make. One of our panels will be speaking in Spanish. Panelists will be speaking in Spanish. Therefore, if you want to listen in English, please click on interpretation, and the button at the bottom of the screen, you will see where you can select Spanish and then listen to all the panelists in Spanish or English to listen to English. After we hear from all of our speakers, we're going to take questions from the audience. So if you have questions, I encourage you to submit them through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can do that at any time. We'll do our best to get in as many questions as possible. This session is recorded and it's on the record. A video recording of the session will be available following its end. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the first speaker, Lisa Moon, who's the president and CEO of the Global Food Banking Network. Lisa, you have the floor.
Wonderful. Thank you, Catherine, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you all for being with us today. It is such a pleasure to be here with Juan Carlos, Arlene, and Stephanie, and Catherine to talk a little bit about the challenge of child hunger and what we can be doing collaboratively, both with government, civil society, and the private sector to be combating this. I'm going to go ahead and just have a few slides to talk through specifically about the food banking model and how we are fortunate to support organizations around the world that are fighting child hunger. And so we'll go ahead and get started. So I know that this is a fabulous joint session today with colleagues from the Global Child Nutrition Foundation and partners there, as well as the food banks that the Global Food Banking Network serves. So I wanted to start out, though, for those that might not be familiar with the food banking model and touch a bit on that. So food banks are community-based organizations, and they were founded approximately 50 years ago. And since that time, they have actually been established in more than 70 countries worldwide. And really the crux of the model takes a look at the challenge or the opportunity that a significant amount of food that is produced for human consumption doesn't actually make it to the plates of people in general. And so it's a significant percentage. We're getting better and better data on how much food is lost or wasted all the time, but experts suggest that about a third of all food that is produced for human consumption goes to waste. And what food banks are positioned to do is to capture that wholesome, edible surplus food and redirect it to people in need or people facing hunger. And so these local organizations form relationships with food producers, retailers, manufacturers in their communities, and then work with community-based organizations that are providing a whole range of social services to reach people that may not be able to access enough food to meet their daily needs. And some of the community-based organizations that food banks worldwide work with are schools and other educational groups that are reaching school-age children that may not be able to have access to enough food. To give you a sense of the reach of food banks, I'll talk a little bit about the food banks that the Global Food Banking Network, or GFN as we call, works with directly. But to give you a sense, this is a model that is quite widespread and has a significant impact. Many on this webinar are familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals. One thing that we do at GFN is track progress towards 2 specific Sustainable Development Goals that are especially relevant for food banks. The first one is 12.3, which really looks at halving food loss and waste by 2030. And the second is SDG 2, which is zero hunger. And so what we did is we calculated the impact of food banks worldwide, including those based in America and in Europe. And in collaboration with those partners, discovered that food banking worldwide is actually providing food for approximately 66.5 million people last year. And that has quite a bit of an environmental impact as well. So the point, though, of what I'm trying to say is that these community-based organizations, when combined, have the power to be incredibly transformational for the hunger challenge. So a little bit about GFN. Our vision is a world free of hunger, and we work to help nourish the world's hungry through uniting and advancing food banks. We are a support organization and really exist to come alongside and support and partner with incredible local leaders who are running community-based food banks or national networks really in their home countries. Juan Carlos, of course, who we'll hear from in a little bit, runs an amazing network of food banks based in Colombia, and we provide support, best practice sharing, knowledge sharing, and some catalytic investment to allow these leaders to achieve hunger relief in their communities. And this just gives you a sense really of kind of the state of food banking that GFN is engaged with right now. So you can see most significantly, we're working with those in Central and South America and the Asia Pacific region, and then increasingly in Sub-Saharan Africa. So the crux of this issue is really along the lines of the opportunity that we have in food banking to support child hunger. Arlene, Mitchell, and Catherine too will talk about just the importance of school feeding programs and the incredible impact they can have on educational outcomes, on making sure that children get to school and stay in school, especially girls. And ideally, these programs are nationally run. However, that's not the case in many countries worldwide. And so in many places, civil society groups like food banks have stepped in to provide important child hunger relief programs and child feeding programs. We just issued a report a couple of weeks ago that looked particularly at what food banks in the GFN network were doing to roll back child hunger, specifically in school age programs. Last year, the network served about 6.2 million children, as defined as between those up to age 18. And they combated child hunger predominantly through partnering with these community-based organizations. So just to give you a sense of what that looks like, in 13 countries, 23 food banks that we work with are managing school breakfast programs. And Stephanie Slingerland on this call will talk a little bit about that. And Juan Carlos has a fantastic school breakfast program that the food banks in Colombia manage. In food banks in 6 countries, we're handling school lunch programs. We also have food banks in 3 countries that manage backpack programs, and those are programs where they provide children at school with food rations that they then take home to their families. So you're not just reaching children at school, you're also reaching the households that they live in that may also be facing food insecurity. We have food banks providing summer and holiday food programs, and there's a number of them also that do food and nutrition education. There's an amazing program, for example, in Western Australia that really looks at how we can be talking to children about the types of foods that do great things to their bodies, and how to make sure that they're eating nutritionally diverse foods. And that in and of itself has had great success in introducing fruits and vegetables and other types of foods that children may not have had exposure to, or that because their families may not be able to access those or afford them. And that's had great impact. And I think that the conclusion, though, this report that really stood out to us was that while food banks are well positioned to address child hunger and would like to continue to expand their programs, 74% of food banks report funding as a barrier, and 54% report specific food procurement as an obstacle. So there's a real opportunity here, I think, around in places where national school feeding programs or child hunger programs are insufficient, which is in the majority of countries worldwide, leveraging food banks to step up and help fill those gaps to make sure that we are able to meet the nutritional needs of our children. Of course, this webinar is happening during an incredible time, incredibly unprecedented and difficult time for the world, of course, with the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Henrietta Holzman-4 in September shared that more than 800 million children are still not in school. They're either learning remotely or their schools continue to be closed. And this is a big challenge, regardless of where you live in the world, for children that access meals at school. And so one of the things that we have been most excited about related to our partnership with the Global Child Nutrition Foundation is really thinking through, in times of COVID, how can we be investing and supporting food banks that we work with to continue to reach children in their communities during this time. I think that one of the big things on our minds, of course, is once schools are able to reopen, making sure that all children do come back to school. And is there a role for where, school feeding or child hunger programs, and making sure that we get kids, back in school, especially girls. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it back over to Catherine, and really looking forward to today's discussion.
Wonderful, Lisa, thank you so very much. And we look forward to hearing more from you too, but that's a wonderful way to open. It's my pleasure now to introduce Arlene Mitchell, who is the Executive Director of the Global Child Nutrition Foundation. Arlene, you have the floor.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm going to pull up a slide now, and here we go. So I'm with the Global Child Nutrition Foundation, and I am delighted to be here today with you all to talk about school meal programs and food banks and how we can work together to address child hunger around the world. Lisa's presentation was fantastic. I really appreciate it. It sets the stage very nicely for what I plan to say now. The question of food banks and school feeding collaborating has been around for a long time. School feeding is my perspective, of course. I've been working on it for many years. And about 20 years ago was the first time I was approached to talk about whether school feeding and food banks could collaborate. And at that time, it didn't work out. But I have paid attention to these issues over the years and have learned more and more about food banks. I was particularly impressed when we held our Global Child Nutrition Forum, which is an annual event in Tunisia in 2018, where I, for the first time, actually had an opportunity to see a school feeding program collaborating with food banks. And it was particularly exciting because they were using new technology. They were actually trying to use blockchain and other technology to better manage food supplies and to trace the food right from the origin in the field all the way to the children consuming it at school. In 2019, Lisa Moon called me, and she called me at a moment where we were just beginning to conduct our first global survey of school meal programs around the world. This is a study of standard information from each country that has large-scale school feeding programs. And we plan to update it periodically, but we really are capturing this information in order to understand what's going on in the field, what's going on the ground, and to help countries and stakeholders to share information and learn from one another. As Lisa and I were talking that day, I realized that we missed an opportunity to ask about food banks in our survey because we were aware that there were some activities where school feeding and food banks were collaborating. But we've learned a lot through the survey. We know that over 100 countries around the world serve school meal programs, reaching hundreds of millions of children. Our survey actually has captured an in-depth look at least 85 of those countries that have large-scale school feeding programs. And some of the highlights from that survey and the survey itself are available on our website, which I'll show later, and through the Gcnf booth at this forum that we're holding this week and next. And we plan to share the results of that survey more broadly, and we think it could be of interest to those working in food banking as well as those working in school meal programs. Anyway, after that conversation, Gcnf and the Global Food Banking Network began to explore collaboration, starting with identifying some of the countries that have both programs going, and thinking about how we could partner to ensure that more school-age children have access to nutritious food. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit, things moved onto a fast track. And as I began to talk about what we're learning from this current experience, we have to go back to look at a little bit at why school feeding might be interested in food banks and why food banks might be interested in school feeding. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions to you in the audience to think about. The first one is, no matter what your experience is or where you work, do you actually think that food banks and school feeding actually serve the same population? Are they reaching the same people? Well, Lisa's presentation showed very clearly that many food banks are reaching school-age children. But in general, I think food banks are geared more toward families and people in particular need, like the elderly, et cetera. And school feeding programs target school-age children pretty exclusively. Second question is, do food banks and school feeding source their food in the same way, from the same suppliers? Well, not really, although there could be some overlap. School feeding has to work through the official school system in a country in order to reach children in public schools, but most food banks operate more as a nonprofit, non-governmental organization, which is a different kind of flexibilities, et cetera. But despite these differences and overlaps, COVID-19 has opened our eyes and brought some new lessons. And I want to talk a little bit about that now. So there are only there are a limited number of options for where families who do not produce their own food can source food. So if you have money, for example, you can purchase food in an open market or at a grocery store or at a restaurant or fast food chain, a street vendor. And some people actually source their food directly from farmers. If you don't have money, however, then your options might be school feeding if you're a school-age child, or your family may receive food through the food bank. In the case of the pandemic, and as it started and spread, what happened? Well, the economy began to shrink. Many people lost their jobs or were unable to earn as much as they had before. Schools closed. Markets were, people were told that markets might not be safe. Even grocery stores were less safe than before. Restaurants and fast food outlets were closing. Street vendors, if they weren't forced to close, sometimes closed just because they had fewer customers, et cetera. And in some cases, it was even harder to get food directly from farmers. Food banks, however, continued, were open, and were very busy, and had an increasing demand for their services. The food that had originally been destined for markets, for restaurants, for street vendors, from farmers, et cetera, suddenly had to shift to find an outlet, and food banks became an outlet for this food to prevent waste and to use this, what was surplus because it's the original market had been closed. So there's much that we've learned from the pandemic, and we have examined some of the things that happened that we've learned about in the short term. And we know that things need to be very context specific, but here are a few things that we've discovered worked or could work during a pandemic kind of situation that would bring food banks and school feeding closer together. One thing that can happen is that school food workers can be redeployed to work in food banks when schools are closed. They have similar skill sets, they have similar interests in feeding people, and there may be an opportunity for redeploying them to food banks. Food banks, as Lisa pointed out, have become alternative distribution points when children can't and their families can't access schools. Joint training for school food and food bank workers could be very beneficial, since the rules of the game have changed around social distancing, wearing masks, washing hands, et cetera. There's some similarities in the kinds of things that school food workers and food bank workers needed to learn together. We were able to find instances where the registration for school meal programs quickly allowed food banks and others to identify particularly vulnerable children and to pivot their efforts to make sure that they were served through food banks. And as Lisa mentioned, that procurement is a big issue, that we find that there are opportunities in some cases for joint procurement where we can reduce costs by working together, but we can also determine if there is surplus, et cetera, how to share that surplus or oversupply. So these are a few opportunities that we've already identified for school feeding and food banks to collaborate. Again, they need to be very context specific. And we're not suggesting that these are the only ways, but we would say that if you're in a setting where there's both food bank and school feeding programs, it might be a good time to consider linking up to investigate whether and how you could collaborate. So to conclude, Gcnf is linking up with the Global FoodBanking Network. We announced our new partnership a few months ago. Thanks to the generous support of the General Mills Foundation, we're now doing a more in-depth joint study to learn about what happened during the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we plan to share those lessons with our mutual networks. We plan to do joint advocacy about hunger and to share data and publications. We're very impressed with recent publications that GFN has done. And we hope that you will be interested in the results of our survey as well. We're definitely going to ask a couple of food bank related questions in the 2021 version of our global survey of school meal programs when it gets underway mid-year next year. And we're also looking at specific locations where we can jointly support new or expanded collaboration. So we are very excited about this partnership, and we believe that we will find multiple ways and multiple locations for our collaboration to proceed. We hope that those of you listening are also excited and we're interested in learning and about your ideas and hearing your ideas about how to reach more children through our collaboration. The need is very great and we need all the help we can get. So we thank you very much. And now back to you, Catherine.
Thank you very much, Arlene. Thanks for those wonderful thoughts. And I think there's so many similarities between these two organizations that you've highlighted some of the ways that they can work together. And we'll talk about that more when we get to the Q&A, but thank you for opening that way. Next, we'd like to hear from someone who runs a food bank network for his entire country, and that is Juan Carlos Buitrago Ortiz. He's Executive Director of the Asociación de Bancos de Alimentos de Colombia. Welcome, Juan Carlos, you have the floor.
Catherine, buenos días.
Good
Saludos.
morning. Very special greetings for Lisa and Anthony, Monica, everybody. I'm going to share my screen now.
Muy bien.
Very good. In Colombia, about 2 years ago, we got together different organizations, the national government, the presidency of the republic, industry, the food industry that is very active working with food banks. The biggest retail is called Éxito in Colombia. And food banks in Colombia, we made a huge partnership to feed children. Our mission, our dream, our aspiration was that Colombia would be the Latin American country with the best childhood nutrition by the year 2030. You know, this is a difficult goal to achieve, but what we believe and what we want, we know that we need to eradicate chronic malnutrition. We need to stop children from being underweight, malnutrition, acute malnutrition, etc. So in order to do that, the first thing that we did by the end of last year, we completed 2 studies. These were scientific studies done with the Food Banking Network in Colombia. And we did like an initial review, an initial analysis to see what the nutritional situation was for children all around the country. So we looked at all the secondary sources of information, we analyzed them, we looked at all the different indicators that affect directly or indirectly children nutrition in Colombia. So this is just an example. We reviewed poverty and what it's doing to the country, access to potable water, access to sewer and power. We talked about food insecurity, chronic and acute malnutrition, and so all the different indicators that affect children nutrition so that we could really understand what the status was for nutrition in the country. And then we did a second study, and this time we reviewed what the experience was throughout the world, those countries that were able to improve childhood nutrition. So we analyzed this and we looked at all the studies that showed significant differences, statistically significant differences, and to see what experiences were already proving to be useful. So we summarized this and we divided it into 2 categories. And we defined the 50 interventions that we had to implement in Colombia in order to improve childhood nutrition. Can you see here, out of those 50 things, what has to happen in the country for this to happen? One of the 50 things is we need to, of course, reduce food waste and food loss. So with the food bank in Colombia, we work on several of the 50 things that need to happen. For instance, we do have an emergency program. Whenever there is a national emergency, we work with the national government. We're already working on that. And we are promoting strategies for self-sourcing of food. We have farms, we work with family farms, and we have programs like the one that we're going to show you. And of course, healthy children, healthy countries. And we want to work with the vulnerable children in the country. The national strategy. So how's this going to work? How do we want to implement this? We need to look at what the goals are, and we know what the 50 interventions are that we need to implement in the country. So we are looking at the government to see what they're doing for each one of the different areas, the private entities, what are they doing in terms of these 50 interventions, the NGOs and the multilateral associations or organisms, what are they doing? So we need to understand what each one of these actors is doing. And we started to work together, establish priorities in order to improve the different activities. And the idea is that we all have to have the same goal. We have to have the same objective. We all want to improve child hunger. So we're going to join our efforts, our resources, our capacities, and we are going to have a plan of action for 2030 so that we can use all our resources and reach our goals to work with every child in Colombia. So one of the things that we do, and we do many, many things, but one of the big projects that we have is called Healthy Breakfasts. And the project right now is in the process of being developed and strengthened. And in order to work with this project, we had to understand, for instance, what was the prevalence of the uh, eating of fruits and vegetables. We wanted to know how often and how frequently children eat fruits and vegetables in Colombia. We wanted to see the prevalence of eating dairy products or milk. Not every child in Colombia drinks milk or dairy products. So we needed to understand exactly what was happening. And we wanted to see how we could change things. Um, there is one very serious disease, chronic malnutrition. We have almost 560,000 children in Colombia that suffer from chronic malnutrition. We know that these kids will develop, they will have IQ problems, 14.6 less points. They get less education. They have lower salaries when they grow up. So we know we need to work on this. We have healthy breakfast in 9 of our banks, food banks. We work with 55 beneficiaries, and we are working with 3,400 children between 1 and 12 years of age. So the program has like a standard breakfast, and we have some. This is the minimum that everybody is offered. They have to get some cereal, some fruit, and milk. The program's objective is for children to have breakfast, to have this breakfast before 9 o'clock every morning, so that children can start their day with a good nutrition. And we put together a lot of different organizations that work on this with us. Kellogg's is one of our most important strategic partners. And we also have 2 different dairy companies in Colombia. They compete with each other normally, but they work together with us, working to help the children. We also have a logistics company that is helping us with transportation throughout the country, and the food banks in Colombia. We do have a very good program. We have the recovery program for food surplus recovery program, and they help us with the project too. And we also have Newell Brands that is helping us. They have like a school kit that they help us with. And Abaco is the Association of Food Banks in Colombia. We help. We do all the work of articulation and coordination. We have been able to establish alliances or partnerships with farmers in Colombia, and we are adding, for instance, chicken to the diet. We try to get other products that the children need, like clothing, computers, toys, and we also want to improve education regarding nutrition. It's not just giving them food, but educate them so that they improve their diets and they improve their condition. Abaco then works with the government, so we make sure that they receive all the support they need. And at Abaco, we promote the good national policies. We are promoting for some of the territories to have local policies that decrease the waste waste and food loss. And with this healthy breakfast program, then what we're doing is we're improving children nutrition. It's, I repeat again, this is done within the framework of a huge partnership. Many things happen. We work with many different organizations, many different actors. And what I want you to remember, especially our colleagues at other food banks, it's really important to be able to work with all the different sectors, with all the different territories, and so that you can multiply the results and you can improve the lives of all children in the country. So this healthy breakfast program in Colombia, we are helping 3,400 children. They're vulnerable children. They're growing up healthier, happier, and more intelligent. So with this, I end. Thank you so much. I leave my information here if you want to hear a little bit more about the national strategy or about healthy breakfasts or about Abaco. Thank you so much. And I'm going to give the word to the next presenter.
Thank you very much, Juan Carlos, for a very impressive description of what you're doing. Very impressive description, and we appreciate it and look forward to talking more about it in the Q&A. May I remind participants, if they would like to have a question asked in the Q&A, please put it down on the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Next, I'm very pleased to introduce Stephanie Slingerland, Senior Director of Philanthropy and Social Impact at the Kellogg Company. Your company's already been mentioned, Stephanie, and we look forward to hearing more about your work. Stephanie, you have the floor.
Yes, hello, and thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you all virtually today and talk a bit about the work that we're doing at Kellogg Company to support the issue of hunger and food security. I thought I would start with a little bit of background about the work that we do. As a food company, it's probably not surprising that we have a focus on the issue of hunger. We know the importance of making sure that families have access to the nutrition they need. And when they don't, we want to make sure that they have access to that. So we do that through what we call our Kellogg's Better Days program, which takes a look at the holistic issue of food security, not only doing work to make sure that people are getting access to the food that they need, but making sure that there's enough food for everyone. So that includes important things like nourishing with our foods, ensuring that we're helping to deliver nutrients of need to people across the world. It ensures that we are working with farmers. We heard from some of the other speakers about sourcing all the way back to the farm. We do a lot of work with farmers to ensure climate-smart agriculture practices, to help farmers increase their yields of crops while also improving their livelihoods. And we have a particular focus, as we're talking about today, on feeding programs, especially feeding programs for kids. We have been doing this work for over 20 years, and it started with a particular focus on child feeding programs, breakfast programs. As the world's largest cereal company, it's probably not something that we would focus in this area, knowing how important it is for people to start their day with breakfast, but particularly with kids, ensuring that they have access to the nutrition they need to start their day the right way, and making sure that they're ready to learn at school. And we know, as we've heard about, the importance of those programs and making sure that kids get access to that nutrition each and every day. Lisa talked about the a recent study research report that came out from Global FoodBanking Network, which we were proud to be a sponsor of, given our work in this space and our longstanding partnership with GFN. And it just continued to underscore the importance of nutrition for children and those first days, and how critical it is for their development, that they're getting access to adequate nutrition during that time frame. And the report also underscored the importance of those feeding programs for kids at school. And we talked a little bit, we heard from the Global Nutrition, Child Nutrition Foundation about the criticality of those feeding programs. And the report that we partnered with GFN earlier this year continued to underscore that. But I would say in my work in this space, we're talking a lot about the importance of the nutrition that these programs provide, and that is absolutely critical. But there's so many other benefits that these school feeding programs provide to kids each and every day. You know, helping them start their day so that they perform better in school. There's research that shows that students who are starting their day with breakfast are performing better in school, that there's reduced instances of behavioral concerns in the classroom. And I've been proud to go to many schools where they've implemented the breakfast in the classroom model. And it's so heartening to see the kids coming in every morning. They often have their own job to perform to help get the class ready for breakfast, whether that's distributing the food or helping everyone get in line to get their food. They take those jobs really seriously. And it's so heartening to see the kids to take that. And it really, as I've talked to teachers, also helps to build a sense of community in the classroom. You know, there's reduced instances of bullying, and students are just much more connected to one another when they're starting that day with breakfast. And so beyond the nutritional benefits that those meals are providing, we also know that there's so many other benefits that those school meals are providing to kids in schools. And I think we've talked about the impacts of COVID are going to be long lasting and continue to have significant impact in our communities in this moment. And these child feeding programs are certainly part of that. I commend the flexibility that food banks and other feeding programs have demonstrated during this time to continue to ensure that children can get access to those meals that they so desperately need. You know, in fact, Lisa and I were talking not that long ago, and she shared a story of, I believe it was a food bank in South America where the teachers actually, you know, after the school closed, they wanted to make sure that the students were still getting the meals that they needed. And so they themselves were packing up those meals and taking them to, you know, small communities, rural communities that were hard to get to. So it's so heartening to see that, you know, the dedication for everyone behind these programs, that even in the face of a pandemic, that we're getting creative to make sure that kids are still getting access to the nutrition they need. And we've seen, you know, many schools shifting their models, whether it's in communities where they, you know, create an access point where families can come pick up those meals because the schools are closed, or if they have buses, maybe they use the school bus to distribute those meals. So it's so heartening to see the resiliency of the feeding network continuing to make sure that we're doing what we do best and making sure that families get access to that important nutrition. But I look forward to the day as more schools are able to open, because we know that there's so many of these other benefits that I've talked to that are so important for those feeding programs and that community and bringing people together, and those benefits that they have for the students. As I mentioned, Kellogg has long been ingrained in this work. It really goes back to our founder, Mr. Kellogg himself, who we call an original conservationist, philanthropist, and well-being visionary for his care and community, for his care for communities, especially children. And that's why this legacy continues on at our company today. But one of the things that I think makes our Better Days program unique, we're doing terrific work, as I said, to help feed millions of people around the globe. We've provided 2.4 billion servings of food since 2015. We've reached over 3 million children through feeding programs. But a key part of this program is engaging others, because we know that no company, no organization, no governmental government can communities alone. This is something that we have to work together to achieve. We have a very strong goals through the Sustainable Development Goals to have zero hunger by 2030. None of us can do that alone. We can't achieve it alone. We have to work together, which is why I'm so thrilled to be with folks here today to demonstrate how we can do that, how we can bring private and public sectors together to help address this issue of food security. And so, we as a company are committed to continuing to do that, working flexibly with you as we continue to ensure that families have access to the nutrition they need as the COVID pandemic continues. We're proud to have provided more than $18 million in food and funds to help support these programs, and making sure that organizations like Global FoodBanking Network and the food banks on the ground have the funds and the flexibility they need. As we mentioned, the ways that we're having to feed families are different in this time. So we want to make sure that the food banks and the organizations continue to have access to the funds and resources they need to be flexible to help continue to support these important feeding needs. And we look forward to the day that we're able to continue to come out and force and volunteer, which is another key part of the work that we do at Kellogg, and engaging others in this journey with us, and bringing our employees around food packing events and going to food banks. We've continued to do this as much as possible, and we will continue to do that going forward, working collaboratively side by side with these organizations, because we know how important it is. And it's staggering to see, the numbers of people facing food insecurity doubling because of the pandemic. And so, through our Better Days program, through partnerships that we have with Global FoodBanking Network and others around the globe, we're committed to working side by side with you. And that also includes advocating for the importance of these programs. I think that's something else that the private sector can help bring to this important work. For example, we have been advocating alongside of our partners for the expansion of these school feeding programs. And I think when a company with the gravitas of Kellogg and others come alongside our partners like Global FoodBanking Network and others to advocate for the importance of these programs, we now see, and we have that report that I mentioned earlier that talks about how critical these school feeding programs are in childhood development. And the long-term benefits that these have, but also if we don't have these programs, the long-term impacts that can mean for communities, economic and otherwise. And so we want to lend our voice in helping to advocate for these things, and have successfully done so in many cases and in various countries. Working side by side to help make a difference and bring more people along in supporting these programs and making sure that they're sustainable for the long term. So I'm again thrilled to be with you here today, working along side by side with you in this important work, and look forward to any questions that you might have. So let's turn it over to Q&A.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stephanie. Appreciate that, and appreciate the leadership that Kellogg has taken, not only now as you directed, but as you said, since its founding. Let's go to some questions. There are several that have come in on Q&A. I want to circle back to the biggest problem that we're all facing right now, in addition to the normal sourcing and organization, and that's the issue of COVID-19. It's been mentioned, especially by Lisa and Arlene. But Lisa, I wonder if you would circle back to COVID and to some of the new initiatives that you've undertaken, especially relating to school children. I mean, we've talked about the issues of children not being in school, but what else can you share with us about how food banks can help during COVID-19? And also as part of that, I know that your funding has increased dramatically and you've been able to reach many, many more people because companies like Kellogg and others have been so forthcoming over trying to help people that are hungry. So maybe if you could talk a bit about that piece of the expansion around COVID, that would be great. Lisa, you have the floor.
Yes, thanks, Catherine. And I can talk very broadly about how GFN has been able to come alongside our partners, and then would possibly even invite Juan Carlos to talk a little bit about what they have been doing in Colombia. But in essence, of course, when the pandemic began back in March, and even earlier for those that were in Asia, when you saw these closures, of course, there were a tremendous number of people that were immediately out of work. And so much of our workforce globally is, of course, informal. The ability to purchase, food is very limited. They're mainly doing it on a daily or, several days a week basis. And so obviously for those of us that are in the States, we have all been incredibly affected, I would say, by the huge lines of people that are lining up for food banks. And that absolutely is the case worldwide. The majority of our members have seen a 90% plus increase in demand for service. And especially in the early days of the pandemic, that was correlated with social service agencies that are normally distribution partners. In many places, they were not able to operate freely because of very aggressive lockdowns. And even now, several food banking partners have seen vast agency closures. So which means that not only do you have these places where people would normally access food, whether it be in a congregate setting or through maybe a job training program or whatever it happens to be, they're not longer able to access that food, but then also those services that are being provided are not there. So it was truly thanks to the incredible partnership of companies like Kellogg's and so many others that stepped up during a time of great economic uncertainty and a time of great need, and made investments in helping food banks ramp up worldwide, that the network was able to expand so significantly. And just to give you a sense, as I mentioned, in 2019, the food banking organization served by GFN provided meals for approximately 16.9 million people. During COVID-19, that number has jumped to over 22 million people. And most of that increase in service is happening in emerging and developing markets. So to get to the crux of your question, how is GFN able to help? The first thing is that we provided, I'm going to call them continuity and surge grants, investments in all of our members that were eligible to receive investments. Multiple times throughout the pandemic period. And this went to cover the increased cost of food purchasing. Food banks normally recover a significant amount of their product due to supply chain disruptions. It was very difficult to get product at various points during the pandemic. And on top of that, there has been a challenge, regardless, getting key staples, things that people need really if they're getting the majority of their diet from a food bank. So we saw an increase in purchasing, and investments help cover the cost of that purchasing. It also helped cover the cost of logistics, which went up because shifting from a congregate feeding model to one of contactless distribution to reduce the spread of the virus, that caused an increased cost. So those financial investments became very critical. The other thing, though, that we did is that we had, the benefit of having an incredible network in East Asia that had a lot of experience with pandemics, and obviously were there in the early days of the COVID-19 crisis, and were able to share practices for what food banks could expect prior to it kind of, flooding the rest of the world. And so it was really because of those learnings that we had many partners that were able to secure, licenses to distribute in their communities in spite of very severe lockdowns, how to shift to contactless distribution, how do you manage volunteers or lack thereof in the setting, and et cetera. From the child feeding perspective, Juan Carlos can talk a bit more about this, but what we've seen is food bank partners working with schools to identify where children live, or working with agencies to identify where children live, and then doing family feeding in that way, using schools either as a drop point or doing delivery to those homes. So it's a little bit about the ongoing crisis that we're seeing.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Very helpful. And so, Juan Carlos, can we come to you then and ask you a similar question about how the Colombian network is working beyond COVID-19 in order to find children and be sure that they're fed? Juan Carlos, you have the floor.
Bueno, gracias. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to tell you that the network grew its operations with COVID. We had to take care of more people. Before COVID, we were taking care of 650,000 people. Now we are assisting 1.8 million people. We've had higher peaks. If we add all the peaks of the food banks in Colombia, we could say that this year we have taken care of 2.7 million people. And like Lisa was saying, the help has been impressive. We've received a lot of help from Kellogg, from GFN. GFN has helped us to obtain many donations, and we have invested in many things. First of all, taking care of ourselves, because we couldn't close the food banks. We had to update safety protocols, change some things in our locations. So taking care of ourselves so we wouldn't have to close the banks and maintain the operation. And we had to obtain more warehousing, more logistics because of the increased number of donations, and also the relation with the beneficiaries had to change. For example, we don't allow those beneficiaries to come to the bank anymore. We take the food to different foundations, different places. Many organizations that used to have children sitting in a dining hall cannot do that anymore. So logistics is much more complex. We have to package food now so it can be delivered to each individual child. And so the operations have been really impressive. I think we have double the number of food delivered compared to last year. And again, thanks to all of the donors, Kellogg's and many other organizations, and GFN.
Thank you very much, Juan Carlos, and thanks for all your efforts of you and your colleagues to overcome these hurdles to reach and to be able to reach so many more people. Arlene, we started the conversation by talking about the similarities. You talked about some of the similarities between the school feeding operations and the food banking operations. And so I want to ask you also if you could talk about coming from the perspective of training. I think probably a lot of people on the call are people who are here because the Food Banking Network has annual training sessions for all its folks. Of course, this year it's virtual and not in person. But you do the same thing for our school feeding, and I have been to one of your sessions, so I know about the energy and the commitment of the people who go there, which is similar to that of the people that go to the food banking trainings. So I'm wondering if that's also, if there are learnings that can be shared between the school feeding people and the food banking people in terms of training and development. I don't mean financial development at this point, but development of expertise. Arlene, you have the floor.
Thank you. Well, I think the best example of that is today. This discussion is taking place during our first virtual forum, we call it, the first time in 22 years that we've held our annual conference virtually. And having this opportunity to have Juan Carlos in Colombia and Stephanie where she's based and Lisa where she's based and me in Seattle and Catherine in New York, for example, and people from all over the world able to watch this is a real opportunity. And I think we're learning from the Global Food Banking Network about how to manage this new virtual world. And hopefully we've been presenting some opportunities for others also. But basically what we are creating in all of these cases, I think in the vFBLI that GFN does and our forum, is we're really, we think, helping more children and more families to get needed food by better sharing of best practices and learning across borders, across organizations, across all of the partnerships and networks that we have. So we normally, for example, in our annual forums, we normally have them in person. We do a week-long set of training and activities together in a different location each year so that we can see what's happening on the ground. I gave the example in Tunisia 2 years ago. Last year we were in Cambodia. And that opportunity to bring people together, we usually get 50 to 70 countries, government officials, various academic people, private sector partners, et cetera, coming together around the same issue to learn together and share. Now we can expand that virtually. And so I think one of the things that we look forward going into the future is how we can really help to address pandemic issues and the learning and sharing process, even if we have to use new tools to do that, and we can share our experience together. But we have found that this peer learning environment, which both of us share, the GFN and Global Child Nutrition Foundation, peer learning is probably the fastest and most effective way of learning. When you talk to someone whose role in life is very similar to your own, you speak the same language, you have the same concerns, and you can very quickly share and make a difference through that kind of peer learning structure. So we're looking forward to our 23rd forum next year. I can't say if it'll be in person or it will be virtually, but we hope that our food banking partners can join us, and we will look forward to other opportunities to share learning as we are today.
Great. Well, thank you, Arlene, and thank you for all the school feeding people and all the food banking people that are here listening today and sharing. Several people talked about the private sector, and we have a couple of questions about the private sector too, Stephanie. So maybe you can share some thoughts with us. You your company is a leader. There are many others, of course, but what can people do in the system, in the food banking system or the school feeding system, to reach out to more private sector partners? How do we convince partners, whether they're small retail potential partners right in our own hometown, or whether they're big multinational companies? What's the best way for networks to consider approaching private sector? That's kind of one piece of this. People are also asking how you could fund their particular country, so you could check that maybe on the chat and follow up. But in general, I think we would like to get some tips from you about best ways to approach. And one of the nice things about both of these networks, in my humble opinion, is that both of them consider private sector critically important partners in achieving an effort to end hunger. So everyone wants to find ways to strengthen our connections and network. Stephanie, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. So I think, one of the ways that we can continue to work together is leveraging the allies that we do have. So, as I mentioned through our Better Days program, a key tenet of that is how we can engage more people in this journey with us. And we recognize we have the power of our brands behind doing that. And that includes engaging people across our supply chain. So you mentioned, for example, how do you engage the small retailer? Well, we have connections with those retailers, and we can work together to try to create joint partnerships and programs together that benefit all of our shared objectives, right? So, I think of some of the things that we've already been doing this year. We've actually increased, one of the, I think, things that the COVID-19 pandemic has done has raised more awareness for the issue of hunger, right? Lisa said, we see on the news the lines of cars that are at food banks to get food parcels. And so we as a company have seen greater interest in creating programs that engage customers and consumers in this issue. and bringing them to whether it's to a store or on a digital platform. We're seeing increased engagement in that. And so I think that's something that, we can help, facilitate as a partner working with you all in this space. How can we bring more of those customers, our suppliers? We've had conversations with Global FoodBanking Network, linking some of our suppliers. We talked about the farm to table. How can we connect some of the suppliers that we work with into this work, right? And ensure that less of that food is going to waste and it's going to people who need it. So I think that's a unique role that the private sector can play, right? Is the conduit and some of the networking that we can provide to help engage. And then I know you said there's a lot of questions about how you can continue to engage with Kellogg. I think the key thing is, obviously ensuring that it's aligned to the work. We do have a focus on the key markets where we do our work, because we want to make sure that we're supporting our Kellogg communities first and foremost. But feel free to reach out to me directly through LinkedIn or other channels, and I'm happy to help have those conversations.
Catherine, I'd like to add something here, if I might.
Sure, Arlene, please.
One of the extraordinary things that we're finding, and I'm sure, Lisa, you're seeing the same thing, is that private sector, and Juan Carlos also mentioned it in his presentation, private sector organizations that sometimes compete in the for-profit space actually come together quite nicely around these kinds of food insecurity programs. And we see extraordinary examples of how a competitor helps to bring in another competitor to participate in a program because they see the needs and how great they are. And I think that's something that our two networks really can help to facilitate, is that kind of even between competitors collaborating to feed hungry children.
Super. Thanks very much. Juan Carlos, I know that you welcome private sector contributions. You've showed some of your partners on one of your slides. What happens when somebody wants to give you something that you don't think is particularly nutritious or particularly helpful? And how do you get around that and still maintain the good relationship with the partner?
Muy bien. Bueno,
well, very good. This is a recommendation for all food banks in the world. And I'm going to explain from the most simple things to the most complex ones. The first thing is healthy nutrition, appropriate nutrition has to be wholesome, complete, balanced nutrition. Healthy nutrition means variety, and that's very important, which means every person has their own nutritional requirements. They're all different, and we have to understand what those nutritional requirements are for those people that we're helping. Food by itself is not damaging, is not hurtful. Human beings must be able to eat all types of food. So the food itself is not harmful. What is harmful is if you eat an excess of a certain product. The bad nutritional habits is the problem, or the lack of physical activity is the problem. So that's why the food education and nutritional education is fundamental. So food banks, on top of delivering food, we have to provide education for everybody that we're serving. And that is the key, because I think with education, when you offer education, you help them develop habits, especially when you're talking about the youngest children. So the food donated to us, that perhaps is not that nutritious. I mean, it helps because, we all need calories. Human beings need calories anyway. So we need to deliver them in the right amounts so that we don't have a problem with an excess consumption of a certain product. Ideally, food banks should get counseling from nutritionists and diet experts. Every organization that we work with, we need to know who they work with and what the nutritional needs are for the people they serve, so that we understand when we prepare the packages what they need, and we prepare the appropriate packages with the right amount of food and the types of food according to their life cycle, to where they are, to who they're serving. So our recommendation is, of course, let's get some advice. Let's talk to the nutritionists, and let's make sure that we provide the best food. The things that we buy right now, we are buying, of course, the most nutrition food. And that's going to help us supplement everything else that we get through donations. For instance, in Colombia, we buy beans, we buy lentils, we buy very nutritious food that normally we don't get through donations. And that's what we use to supplement those packages that we deliver. In Colombia, we're trying. This is a process that's going to take years. We're trying to restructure the different categories of food. We're sorting products, and we put similar products together, so that if we reorganize how we structure these different categories of food, then we're going to be able to say, okay, we are giving this much dairy products, this much roots, this much cereal, and so 10 kilograms of dairy products, 10 kilograms of fruits, and then we can estimate how much calcium, how much iron. So we're trying to reorganize. It's not easy to do logistically, because it does change a lot of what we do in terms of storing and transportation. But we really want to try to understand what we receive, how to deliver it to the people to provide better nutrition.
Right. Good. Thank you very much. But while we're on this topic, the questions come in for both you, Juan Carlos, and for Arlene. The question is about, do you ever serve hot meals for children, including more protein like fish or meat? Of course, this has got to be considered both pre-COVID and during COVID, I suppose. There may be a different answer different times. And then also the question was to Juan Carlos that you said sometimes children have selective eating habits. Milk was an example. So how do you deal with that and still give them nutritious food? And this is really a question for both Juan Carlos and for Arlene. So Juan Carlos, do you want to start, and then we'll go to Arlene? Thank you, Juan Carlos.
Bueno, muy bien. El reto es
Good. The challenge is humongous. It's not just dairy products. We see this clearly with fruits and vegetables. 40% of the food that's wasted in Colombia is fruits and vegetables. And food banks in Colombia, we are making a giant effort so that we can recover more fruits and vegetables. And we do have a surplus food recovery program. And almost half of the food that we deliver right now is fruits and vegetables. Why? We make a big effort because we are working the way we're working. We want to promote healthy nutrition, healthy food. So that's a big effort, because that's the most nutritious food that we have in hand. Now, when we look at the numbers and the studies that are done in the country, we hear people do not eat fruits and vegetables. So the effort that we have to make right now, and I insist again, we need to provide education. We need to change habits. We need to build new habits, especially from the time the children are very young, so that they learn to eat fruits and vegetables, so that they can eat raw fruits and vegetables. And in Colombia, we like juice a lot. So this slowly can become a new habit for everybody.
Thank you, Arlene.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about what we've learned through our global survey. One thing we know is that all school feeding programs cover primary school students or some portion of primary school students. And they source foods in different ways. And the most nutritious, most diverse food diets are coming in those situations where programs are purchasing food locally. So we've been promoting locally purchased foods for quite a while. But we also know that some of the most nutritious foods are the most expensive foods. So we're encouraging governments and farmers and others to think about nutrition as an important component of their investments. If they can reduce the cost of very nutritious products, that will help everyone, including the children at school and receiving food through food banks. But right now, calories are cheaper, much cheaper than nutrition is. And so there's a great deal of work to be done in learning how to reduce the cost of these items. Very direct correlation between the amount of funding available and the diversity of the diet served, with the least often served school meals being those including high protein content such as meat, poultry, eggs, dairy. And this is a serious challenge for school feeding going forward, is how to make nutritious food more affordable and at a larger scale. But starting with local products, starting with young children, and Juan Carlos mentioned earlier too, that not just starting with more diverse set of foods for young children, but also the nutrition education that can be provided. In schools and food banks both allow an opportunity to do some serious work on nutrition education, so that we're changing behavior in a way that passes on to the next generation and the next generation.
Thank you. I have to tell a story in the middle here. One time when Arlene and I were working together on school feeding programs, and we were both at the World Food Program, I visited a country which shall remain nameless, who was trying to develop its dairy industry. And they said, do you have any ideas about how we could get more people to drink milk? And I said, yes, serve it in your school lunch programs. And they said, oh, we can't do that. And I said, why not? And well, someone very important in the government already has the concession for soft drink at the school, in the school lunch program. So I suppose there are political issues that one has to deal with as well. Lisa, there's a question about how do you start? If you're a food bank, what would be some of the first steps that you would take if you wanted to have a program that's connected to school feeding? Do you want to try to take that?
Yeah, great question. So the first thing I think would be assessing what the school feeding infrastructure in your community is. If there is a government program in place, in some of our members actually work very closely with the government to provide certain parts of the school meal program that may not be financially feasible to provide. So finding out kind of what the opportunities are in the community, and then also taking a look at what your agency partners are doing. If any of them are working with school age children or working with schools directly, they might be able to provide guidance on that. One of the things that we have launched at GFN through the support of our partners, and obviously that we're working with Global Child Nutrition Foundation on, is to help food banks that want to get into providing school feeding or feeding for school age children, to provide support in that, making sure best practices are in place, and then how to figure out how you can resource a program long term. It's so important, especially with school age children, to make sure that you have a reliable supply of food. And Juan Carlos talked about this with partners. This also involves purchasing in many cases, and lining up the right partnerships. So if you happen to be affiliated with GFN, we encourage you to reach out, and we have people on staff that can work with you and with the support from the Global Child Nutrition Foundation to get started.
Great, thank you very much. Stephanie, I think we have time for just one more question here, so let me come to you. Someone has asked a question about the kind of food that's provided to food banks and whether or not there would be a thought in the future, or maybe it happens already, that companies produce food specifically for food banks. Is that something that happens? Could it happen? Is it something that might be used in the future? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very interesting model. And it's something that I know that we are exploring. So for example, in India, we have a program there called Bright Starts, which supplies food to the school feeding programs. And it's food that we produce specific for that school feeding program because we know that there's certain nutrients of need that the children aren't getting in their diets. And so we ensure that the food that we're producing has those nutrients of need within them. So I do think that there's some interesting idea there and a model that's worth exploring. We have some things where we're learning that particular model to see where it can go, because we know there are certain nutrients of need, you know, like I mentioned in India, and it could be different based on the market, right? And we know that our foods can help provide those nutrients. You know, our portfolio is significantly plant-based, and we know the benefit of eating a plant-based diet on our well-being. And so, you know, I think that that's an interesting role that we can play and how we can continue to advance providing those foods to the people who need it.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I think we're about at time. And so if this, Arlene, is one of the first collaborative efforts beyond staff efforts between the Global FoodBanking Network and the Global Child Nutrition Foundation, I hope that the participants found it to be a useful discussion. I think it was rich and constructive, and let's move on to even better relations and connections in the future, because both organizations are so committed to ending hunger and to using community-based organizations to do that, and a lot of energy in working together in the community as well as with governments and certainly with our private sector partners. So I hope this was a good example of how we can move the needle even further. Thank you very much to all the panelists, to Juan Carlos and to Stephanie, and to the two CEOs of these great organizations, Lisa and Arlene. Thank you all for listening to this and for sending in a lot of good questions. We tried to get to as many as possible. I'm sorry if we didn't reach everyone, but you have an invitation from Stephanie to write to her on LinkedIn. So I hope you do follow up. And also follow up with Arlene and Lisa and their respective organizations with your further questions. We have some special sponsors of the Food Bank Leadership Institute: General Mills, HEB Brambles, Cargill, the DLA Piper Foundation, Fundación Lala, and Ingredion. We want to thank all of them very much for their support. We've recorded this session, as was mentioned at the beginning, and later today you should receive a link with the recording. Please feel free to share it with anyone you think can benefit from this discussion. And all great fortune and energy and good wishes to you in your efforts, wherever you are in the world, to help end hunger and to help children to grow. Thank you.